Japan's hidden island fortresses revealed now. Can I find Japan's most secret island fortresses before anyone else? Start with a visually stunning shot of a hidden island fortress and an intriguing question like, what if I told you Japan's most strategic secrets are hidden in plain sight, on islands you've never heard of? Briefly introduce the concept of Japan's island fortresses, explaining that these aren't just ancient ruins but strategically important, often overlooked, architectural marvels. Explain why these fortresses were built, the need for defense against invasion, control of trade routes, or protection of vital resources, highlighting the historical context and threats Japan faced. Showcase 2 to 3 specific examples of these hidden island fortresses. For each, you should briefly describe its location, key features, and historical significance, using maps, archival images, and current footage where possible. Focus on one particularly impressive or well-preserved island fortress, detailing its most ingenious defensive features, a dramatic historical event it was involved in, or a surprising revelation about its purpose. Summarize the overarching importance of these hidden island fortresses in shaping Japan's history and defense, emphasizing their often forgotten legacy. Ask viewers to share in the comments which island fortress they found most fascinating and encourage them to subscribe for more explorations of Japan's hidden history. January 7, 1944. The Central Pacific. The sun is a white-hot coin pressed against a pale blue sky, draining the color from the horizon until the sea and the heavens melt into a single, shimmering void. On the island of Inuitaluk, the air does not move, it weighs. It is thick with the scent of evaporating salt, decaying coral, and the faint, metallic tang of coconut husks drying in the heat. A Japanese lookout, his uniform stiff with dried sweat and crystalline salt, squints through his binoculars. He sees nothing but the rhythmic pulse of the surf against the outer reef. Yet, beneath his feet, the very earth feels hollow. The island is no longer just land. It has been hollowed out, reinforced with ironwood and poured concrete, transformed into a silent, subterranean predator waiting for a shadow to fall across the water. This was the reality of the inner defense line, a desperate and monumental shift in Japanese strategy that would define the bloody twilight of the Pacific War. For 2 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had sought the decisive battle at sea, believing a single, cataclysmic clash of carriers would shatter American resolve. But after the devastating losses at Midway and the attritional nightmare of the Solomons, the High Command in Tokyo realized the ocean was no longer their shield. It was a highway for the industrial might of the United States. To survive, the empire had to stop looking at the horizon and start looking into the dirt. They began to craft the secret island fortresses, stationary unsinkable carriers carved into the volcanic rock and coral of the Central Pacific. These were not merely defensive positions, they were psychological labyrinths designed to turn the American advancement into a slow, grinding crawl through a charnel house. The Japanese soldiers who arrived at these outposts in late 1943 did so with a sense of grim, almost religious expectation. They had been told that these islands were the immovable breakwaters of the empire. In their minds, they envisioned grand battlements, vast storehouses of rice, and the opportunity to meet the enemy in a glorious, honorable defense of the emperor's sovereign soil. They expected a traditional fortress where the strength of their spirit, the Yamato Damashii, would be shielded by impregnable walls. However, the reality they met was a claustrophobic existence of darkness and dampness. As the American island-hopping campaign accelerated, these soldiers found themselves living like insects in the earth. The fortresses were often nothing more than interconnected tunnels where the humidity reached 90% and the only light came from flickering oil lamps that consumed the precious oxygen. The expectation of a heroic stand was replaced by the reality of starvation, scurvy, and the relentless, rhythmic thud of distant American naval shelling that never seemed to stop. The scale of this subterranean construction was staggering, a feat of engineering born of desperation. On islands like Polileu and Iwo Jima, the Japanese 14th Division and the 109th Division, respectively, utilized natural limestone caves, expanding them into multi-level honeycombs. Factual records from the Japanese 2nd Imperial Engineering Unit indicate that on Polileu alone, over 500 caves were fortified and connected. These were not simple holes, they were sophisticated bunkers with reinforced concrete entrances, sliding steel doors, and ventilation shafts designed to withstand 1,000-pound bombs. General Todamaki Kuribayashi, the architect of the Iwo Jima defense, issued a set of courageous battle vows, demanding that each man kill 10 Americans before he himself fell. The data reveals the terrifying effectiveness of this shift, whereas earlier banzai charges resulted in quick American victories with low casualties. The static defense of the island fortresses saw American casualty rates skyrocket. In the Gilberts and Marshalls, the ratio of Japanese to American deaths had been lopsided. By the time the Americans hit the volcanic rock of the inner ring, they were paying for every square yard of sand with the lives of their brothers. Throughout this period of subterranean misery, a single sound began to haunt the Japanese defenders, vibrating through the coral walls of their tunnels, the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the American bulldozer. To the Japanese, the bulldozer was more than a construction vehicle, it was the symbolic avatar of American democracy and its terrifying abundance. While the Japanese soldiers spent weeks hand-chiseling a machine gun nest out of the rock, the American Seabees would land and, within 48 hours, carve a fully functional airfield out of the jungle using the sheer, brute force of their machinery. This sound, the relentless, low-frequency growl of the diesel engine, represented a civilization that did not view the landscape as a sacred barrier, but as a problem to be solved through logistics and steel. The bulldozer was the sound of a nation that could afford to move mountains, a nation that treated the building of a runway with the same industrial efficiency as the assembly of a sedan in Detroit. It was the sound of abundance overrunning the meager defenses of a starving empire. As the months bled into 1944, the perception of the war underwent a radical transformation within the Japanese ranks. The ideology of the decisive battle died in the darkness of the caves. The soldiers realized they were not the vanguard of an expanding empire, but the forgotten guardians of a shrinking one. The psychological toll was immense. Documented journals found on Saipan and Tinian speak of men who lost the sense of day and night, their world reduced to the smell of their own unwashed bodies and the taste of meager rations. They watched through narrow pillbox slits as the American fleet arrived, not as a collection of ships, but as a floating city. They saw the sheer volume of supplies being offloaded, mountains of crates, endless columns of tanks, and the ubiquitous, roaring bulldozers. The realization began to sink in that they were not fighting a military so much as they were fighting a factory. The belief in spiritual superiority began to crack under the weight of American tonnage. This transformation was not just psychological, it was tactical. The Americans, realizing the islands were now honeycomb fortresses, stopped trying to flush the enemy out with infantry alone. They adopted the corkscrew and blowtorch method. Flame-throwing tanks would sear the entrances of the tunnels, while satchel charges sealed the exits. The very fortresses the Japanese had built to protect themselves became their tombs. Factual accounts from the 1st Marine Division at Polileu describe the horrific efficiency of sealing these secret fortresses. In many cases, the Japanese soldiers inside were not killed by bullets or fire, but by the slow depletion of oxygen once the ventilation shafts were bulldozed shut. The silence that followed the sealing of a cave was more chilling than the noise of the battle itself. It was the silence of a tomb. Yet, even in the face of certain annihilation, the tenacity of the defenders remained a testament to a broken ideology. At Iwo Jima, the underground hospital at Mount Suribachi was a vision of hell, doctors performing surgeries by candlelight while the mountain shook from naval bombardment. The Japanese records state that despite the lack of water and medicine, the soldiers refused to surrender, bound by a code that viewed the fortress as an extension of their own bodies. But the symbolic power of American abundance continued to mock their sacrifice. To a Japanese soldier surviving on a handful of moldy rice and a sip of stagnant water, the sight of an American ice cream barge, a specialized vessel capable of producing 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, was a psychological weapon more potent than the 16-inch guns of a battleship. It signaled a level of logistical luxury that was incomprehensible to a man starving in a hole. It was the ultimate expression of a free society's power, their ability to provide comfort in the midst of chaos. The secret island fortresses were supposed to be the wall that the American tide could not break. Instead, they became the measure of how far that tide had risen. By the time the final fortress fell at Okinawa, the myth of the immovable breakwater had been pulverized into the sea. The war. Proven that no amount of concrete, no depth of tunnel, and no level of spiritual fervor could withstand the combined force of a free people's industrial output and their will to reclaim the world. The fortresses were monuments to a failed dream of isolation and conquest, eventually swallowed by the very jungle and sea they sought to dominate. In the end, the history of these islands is not written in the concrete that remains, but in the silence that now covers them. The rust-streaked pillboxes and the collapsed tunnels of the Pacific are poetic reminders of a fundamental truth. They stand as skeletal witnesses to the fact that when a nation builds its defense solely on the ideology of death and the fortification of the earth, it will eventually be buried by it. True strength is not found in the depth of a cave or the thickness of a wall, but in the fluid, unstoppable abundance of a society that values the life of the individual over the glory of the stone. The roar of the bulldozer has long since faded, replaced by the eternal wash of the Pacific waves, but the lesson remains: freedom does not hide in the dark, it builds in the light, and no fortress, however secret or deep, can ever truly contain the horizon. The transition from the sun-drenched beaches to the suffocating interior of the island fortresses was not merely a change in geography, it was a descent into a different kind of warfare, one where time itself became an enemy. By mid-1944, the Japanese Imperial Army had abandoned the water's edge defense. They no longer sought to stop the Americans at the surf, recognizing that the sheer weight of U.S. naval gunfire, a literal curtain of steel, rendered any surface position a death trap. Instead, the secret island fortresses evolved into fukaku or deep defense systems. On islands like Anggwa and Biak, the transformation was absolute. The soldiers were ordered to become living stones. Factual records from the Japanese 35th Independent Mixed Brigade describe the grueling labor of excavating tochkas, small, reinforced concrete bunkers that were nearly invisible to the naked eye. These were often covered with layers of living coral and coconut husks, blending perfectly into the jagged landscape. The emotional weight of this transition cannot be overstated. The Japanese infantryman, raised on the heroic tales of the samurai and the rapid victories of 1941, now found himself a captive of his own fortifications. The expectation of a glorious death in a charge across a field was replaced by the agonizingly slow reality of starvation in a damn hole. Documented letters recovered from the caves of Saipan reveal a haunting shift in morale. Soldiers wrote not of victory, but of the smell of the earth and the sound of dripping water that measured their remaining hours. They were trapped in a paradox: their fortresses were designed to be impregnable, yet they were also inescapable. As the American forces bypassed certain islands, leaving them to wither on the vine, these secret strongholds became ghost ships made of stone, where men survive on lizard meat and boiled roots while watching the massive American supply convoys sail past toward Tokyo, completely indifferent to their existence. The technical data of these fortifications remains a testament to a terrifyingly focused engineering will. On the island of Corregidor, the Malinta tunnel system was expanded to house an entire underground city, including a 1,000-bed hospital and a power plant. But it was on the smaller, volcanic islands where the engineering reached its most lethal peak. The Japanese utilized reverse-slope defenses, placing their artillery on the back side of hills so they could not be hit by direct naval fire. When the American Marines scaled the ridges, they would find themselves fired upon from behind, from hidden apertures that appeared to be nothing more than cracks in the rock. The U.S. Army's Handbook on Japanese Military Forces, 1944, noted that these positions were so well integrated into the natural terrain that they often remained undetected even after the surrounding area had been cleared. Symbolically, the conflict between these two forces was distilled into a single, recurring object of American abundance, the 10-in-1 ration crate. To the American GI, these waxed cardboard boxes were a mundane part of life, but to the Japanese defender peering through a sniper's slit, they were artifacts of an alien civilization. These crates contained canned meats, evaporated milk, cigarettes, and even chocolate, luxuries that were non-existent in the Japanese supply chain. More importantly, the crates were everywhere. They were used to build revetments, they were burned for fuel, and they were discarded by the thousands on the beaches. To the starving Japanese soldier, the sight of a discarded, half-eaten tin of ration meat was a more devastating blow than a grenade. It represented a society so wealthy that it could afford to waste what the empire could not even provide to its elite guards. The ration crate became a symbol of a democracy that fed its soldiers like kings while the imperial defenders were forced to cannibalize their own supplies. It was the material proof that the decisive battle had already been lost in the factories of the Midwest. As the perception of the war shifted from a struggle of spirit to a struggle of logistics, the Japanese ideology began to warp. The secret fortresses were no longer seen as tools of victory, but as sites of ultimate sacrifice. The Gyokusai or shattered jewel mentality took hold. The transformation was visible in the architecture. The later tunnels were built with kamikaze exits, narrow holes just large enough for a man with a lunch mine to crawl out and throw himself under a passing Sherman tank. The fortress had become a weapon in itself, a suicidal machine made of rock and flesh. Factual reports from the Battle of Polilliu's bloody Nose Ridge highlight that the Japanese 14th Division held out for 73 days in a space less than 6 miles long. The sheer density of the defense meant that for every Japanese soldier killed, the Americans were losing nearly 1 man, a parity that the Japanese High Command hoped would force the United States to the negotiating table. However, the American response was not to negotiate, but to innovate. The transformation of American tactics was equally profound. They turned the islands into laboratories of destruction. The introduction of the Zippo tank, an M4 Sherman equipped with a Ronson flamethrower, changed the nature of the subterranean war. The Americans stopped trying to enter the secret fortresses. Instead, they treated them as industrial problems. They would pump thousands of gallons of gasoline and oil into the ventilation shafts of a cave system and then drop a white phosphorus grenade. The resulting inferno would suck the oxygen out of the entire complex in seconds. The historical records of the 77th Infantry Division at Okinawa detail the clearing of thousands of these positions, often without a single American setting foot inside until weeks later. The secret fortress, once a symbol of Japanese invincibility, had become a pressurized oven. The contrast between the two sides was never clearer than in the moments of mopping up. American Seabees, often working under sniper fire, would continue the work of the bulldozer, literally paving over the Japanese positions. They would fill in the mouths of the caves with coral and sand, sealing the defenders alive in their own secret fortresses. This was the ultimate victory of American abundance over Japanese tenacity, the ability to simply erase the enemy's environment. While the Japanese soldier viewed the island as a sacred temple to be defended to the death, the Americans saw it as an obstacle to be leveled, paved, and turned into a parking lot for B-29 bombers. The sound of the steamroller and the smell of hot asphalt became the funeral dirge for the imperial dream. Epilogue. As we look back at the vine-choked ruins of the Pacific, we find that the secret island fortresses have become something more than military relics. They are the silent witnesses to the moment when the world learned that ideology cannot be built from stone alone. The Japanese soldiers who vanished into the dark tunnels of Iwo Jima and Polillo were not just fighting for an emperor, they were fighting against the inevitable tide of a future they could not comprehend, a future defined by the roar of the engine and the abundance of the assembly line. Those dark, damp corridors were the last bastions of an ancient world attempting to hold back the industrial light of the 20th century. Today, the coral has grown over the concrete. The steel doors have rusted into red dust, and the silence of the islands has returned. But the larger truth remains: freedom and democracy find their strength not in the thickness of a bunker's wall, but in the openness of the sea and the sky. The abundance that the Japanese soldier once feared, the mountains of crates, the fleets of bulldozers, the endless supply of bread and steel, was not just a product of factories, it was the product of a belief that the individual is worth more than the dirt he defends. The secret fortresses were built to be tombs, and in the end, that is all they were. The true fortress of liberty is not found in the darkness of the earth, but in the shared abundance of a world that refuses to be hidden away. The waves continue to hit the shore, washing away the salt and the blood, leaving behind only the lesson that a nation that buries its soul in the rock will eventually find itself forgotten by the sun.